Shut up and get on your knees. This is a rich white neighborhood. Why are you here?" Jeremiah Boone, a former federal judge, was slammed to the ground, cuffed, choked, and beaten by 3 cops, all because of an anonymous tip. No proof, no questions, just skin color. They thought they were cleaning up black trash. 3 minutes later, his ID shut them all up. They didn't catch a criminal. They exposed their own rotten system. What state are you in? If it were you trapped like that, would you stay quiet or raise hell? Jeremiah Boone woke up before sunrise. He didn't need an alarm clock. At his age, people didn't sleep by the hour anymore. They just lay there, listening to time seep through their skin. The small wooden cabin nestled quietly in the countryside of Jasper County, Georgia. No next-door neighbors, no sound of children playing, only the wind whistling through rotting wooden slats and the distant hoot of an owl among the pine trees behind the garden. Jeremiah had lived here for nearly a decade, ever since he disappeared. He boiled water for tea and poured it into a chipped white mug. On the table, amid old newspaper clippings and a frayed Bible, lay a yellowed envelope. No knock at the door, no sound of a car, but it had been there somehow. Boone reached for it. No return address, no postmark. Just one line scrawled in rough black ink. "You think I don't know where?" He sat down. No overt expression, just a subtle dimming in his eyes for a few seconds. Quietly, he opened the Bible, turned to the page marked with an old red string, Psalm 94. He tucked the letter inside. "The wicked will be destroyed by their own evil." He read silently, the words like a time hook pulling him back to where he once stood, on the bench, black robe draped over his shoulders, passing judgment on powerful men who knew only cruelty. Jeremiah Boone was once a federal judge for the Southern District. His name had left many speechless in courtrooms. But what happened after that last case, the one where he dared to bring a police captain to trial for abuse of power, had swept everything away. His reputation, his wife, his faith in the system. He didn't speak to the press, didn't write a memoir, didn't attend judicial reunions. He quietly withdrew to this place. Somewhere no one imagined a man once nominated for the Supreme Court would choose to die in obscurity. But clearly, someone hadn't forgotten him. He stepped out onto the porch, the tea still steaming in his hand. The air was chilly, carrying the scent of dry grass and ash. In the field beyond, a few rusting tractors lay like relics from a forgotten prosperity. Jeremiah squinted. A black crow landed on the wooden fence. It tilted its head at him, then flew away. He took a sip of tea, set the cup down, and whispered, as if to himself, "They haven't forgotten me." Caleb sat cross-legged on the front steps, holding a cracked old Game Boy. As Boone approached, the boy, as usual, turned it off, stuffed it into his jacket, and stood up in one smooth motion. Boone didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough for Caleb to know today was another lesson. The rental house where Caleb and his mother lived sat at the base of the hill, a place locals mockingly called Forgiveness Hollow. It was old and crooked, with broken window frames and a wooden gate that creaked as if complaining it had been built in the wrong place. Trina, Caleb's mother, opened the door, saw Boone, and nodded gently. Her face bore a look of determination laced with fatigue, dark under-eyes, hollow cheeks, a stance always half defensive. Boone sat at the small wooden table near the window. He pulled out a reprinted booklet, the U.S. Constitution, high school edition, and handed it to Caleb. The boy opened to the first page, his eyes lighting up as he skimmed. "I'll finish this and take a test for you?" Caleb asked. Boone didn't reply immediately. He poured water into 2 plastic cups before answering slowly. "You study to know where you stand, not to pass a test." Caleb nodded. He read a few more lines, then looked up. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "If the law is right, why do people still hate kids like me?" The question made Boone pause for a moment. It wasn't a child's question. It was an echo from a system that had once scarred his back. Boone looked at Caleb, but didn't answer right away, then said, "Because people hate those who know more than they're supposed to, and hate even more when they don't stay quiet." Caleb didn't say another word, but his eyes changed, not defiant now, but thoughtful, as if Boone's words had already taken root. Trina stood in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes, but really listening to every word. When Boone stood to leave, she came out, wiping her hands on her apron, and said softly, "Thank you. No one has the patience anymore to teach him it's not his fault." Boone nodded, heading toward the door until her gaze paused at the window. A gray pickup truck passed slowly in front of the house. No horn, no dust. The man behind the wheel wore a low baseball cap, never looked over, but the truck moved slowly enough to make one thing certain. He was watching. Boone didn't ask. Trina didn't explain, but the air in the room unmistakably dropped a few degrees. When Boone stepped outside, Caleb followed a few steps, stopping at the threshold. He didn't wave, just said, "You'll come back tomorrow, right?" Boone turned, replying gently, "If nothing changes," then walked away. On the dirt road back to his cabin, he didn't look back. But he knew behind that pane of glass 3 sets of eyes were fixed on him, a woman accustomed to vigilance, a boy growing up with questions no one would answer, and a stranger, quietly memorizing his every step. The expulsion notice lay still on the dining table, like a blade buried deep in the already tasteless breakfast of Caleb and his mother. Trina held it between 2 fingers, her other hand pressed to her forehead, silent to the point that Caleb, standing nearby, didn't dare ask. Black ink on white paper, written in cold, bureaucratic language. Beneath it was the principal's signature, stamped with a red seal like a final period to a closed case. Boone finished reading, folded the paper, and set it aside. Trina sighed. "I knew this day would come. Just didn't think it'd be this soon." Her voice wasn't angry, just weary, like someone who had lived through this too many times. "I begged them to give him another chance. I apologized, promised I'd supervise him, but they didn't want to give him one." Boone stood up, put on his coat, and grabbed his hat. He didn't say anything to Trina. He just turned to Caleb. "You're coming with me." Jefferson Middle School sat at the end of Main Street, about a 10-minute drive from their house. The school gate, painted white, and the signboard looked as polished and solemn as a freshly refurbished church. Boone entered the principal's office unannounced. The receptionist glanced at him, hesitated, then pushed a button. "Principal Welker will see you shortly." The principal's office smelled of floor polish and new wood. Welker entered, a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair combed back, gray tie, round glasses polished to a gleam. He looked at Boone for a moment and asked, "You are Jeremiah Boone? I'm here for Caleb Jones, Class B7. Welker leaned back. "I'm afraid the school has already made its decision. The student's behavior is not compatible with a serious educational environment. He's 12 years old, didn't bring a weapon, didn't get in a fight. So what exactly made you think he was a threat to a teacher?" Welker was silent. Then he pulled a file from a drawer. Boone took it and opened it. Under the behavior section was a handwritten note in red ink. "Student uses legal terminology to challenge rules. Creates psychological pressure on teacher. Shows signs of being coached by an adult outside the educational system." Boone raised an eyebrow. "And this is a crime?" "You must understand, at that age, if a student can't distinguish between knowledge and defiance..." Boone cut him off. "No, I understand. I understand that when a white kid speaks up correctly, you call it precocious. But when a black kid does the same, you call it threatening." Welker froze, said nothing. Boone flipped to the back of the file and stopped at a small line at the bottom. "Father, unknown. Alleged prior conviction. Sealed record." He looked up at Welker, his voice lower now. "What does this mean?" Welker spoke quickly. "We're just recording the parents' initial registration details." Boone closed the file and stood. "I've heard of you before, Welker. You were a witness in the Briggs case back in 2009. I sat on that bench." Welker turned pale, said nothing more. Boone walked out of the office. Caleb followed silently. As they crossed the schoolyard, a group of students was huddled near a planter. One of them muttered, loud enough to be heard, "That kid got expelled? Good. We'll be safer now." Caleb turned, his eyes flashing, but Boone gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Not every right thing needs to be answered with a roar. Caleb lowered his head, his face flushed red. On the ride home, Boone sat in silence. In his mind, the name Vernon Briggs and that old trial returned like a news broadcast that hadn't yet gone off air. A case he once ruled on. no evidence, allegations are void. But someone, somewhere, had never accepted that as truth. The basement beneath Jeremiah Boone's house smelled of old paper, rotting wood, and soil left untouched for years. He rarely went down there, only when memories wouldn't let him sleep. Boone knelt, pushed aside the third floorboard in the corner near the bookshelf, revealing a narrow crawl space just wide enough for one person. Below was a low-ceilinged room with no electricity, lit only by a hanging oil lamp strung up with wire. The flickering light danced across file boxes marked with his own handwriting from nearly 2 decades ago. Southern Federal Court. Special verdicts. He reached for a faded brown box with bold lettering on the lid. Case: City vs. Vernon Briggs, 2009. The last case he had presided over before his sudden retirement. In Boone's memory, Briggs was a former police captain accused of covering up torture of suspects. But the key witness, a man named Thomas K. Lawrence, had recanted his statement after accepting a settlement proposal from the DA's office, and then vanished. Boone opened the file, leafing through old transcripts, birth certificates, and maps. When he saw the name Thomas K. Lawrence, witness 3, address Maple Hollow, Jasper, his hand stopped. He pulled out a medical affidavit and a copy of a temporary residence permit attached to a local newspaper clipping. That name, Lawrence, wasn't just a vanished witness. He was Caleb's biological father. Boone ran upstairs into his small study and pulled out a copy of Caleb's birth certificate Trina had given him at the beginning. The father's name was blank, but the K in Caleb K. Jones now wasn't random. Thomas K. Lawrence, TMK, had vanished from court records, disappeared from civil records, and now had left behind a 12-year-old boy expelled from school for knowing too much. Boone sat in silence for a while, then pulled open a drawer, retrieved a worn leather notebook, and turned to the first blank page. With a fountain pen, he wrote, "The Lawrence case isn't closed." That afternoon, Caleb returned for tutoring. He still brought the Constitution Boone had gifted him, laying it on the desk like a ritual. But his eyes couldn't hide the worry. "Do you think I could ever be like you, sir?" Boone didn't smile. He sat upright and said, "You could be more, but you must learn one thing I learned too late: how to endure silence without losing your voice." Caleb nodded. He opened his mouth to speak, but Trina entered, carrying a tray of tea. She smiled, but her eyes flicked just once at Boone's open notebook, where the name Lawrence was still visible. No one said anything, but in that fleeting second, she knew he knew, and Boone understood Trina didn't want to revisit it. When the boy went to his room, Trina lingered by the window, watching Caleb's silhouette grow smaller. "If you dig into this," she said softly, "I only ask one thing. Don't let him be hurt again." Boone didn't make a promise, but he nodded. When night fell, Jeremiah Boone once more locked the basement. He returned the key to its hiding place, but this time not to forget, but to prepare to go back. The Maple Hollow neighborhood had no fences, no strangers allowed signs, but every glance made one thing clear. This place wasn't meant for black people. The porches were whitewashed, the wooden fences perfectly painted, and the lawns cut with geometric precision. Everything looked peaceful, even welcoming, but Trina knew that peace only lasted until they showed up. Caleb was riding his bike in the yard when Mrs. Rita stopped him, a widow who lived at the end of the street. Silver hair pinned up neatly, always wearing a string of pearls as cold as the way she looked at people. "You should tell your mother to find somewhere else," she said softly, but without hiding her contempt. "This neighborhood's not a good fit. No one here is like your mother." Caleb froze. She didn't speak loudly, but it was loud enough to wound a child still trying to believe the world had room for someone like his mother. The next day, Trina brought a loaf of banana bread to Mrs. Rita's house. A simple, courteous gesture. A thank you for helping call a plumber the day before. But when Trina knocked, Mrs. Rita cracked the door, glanced at the bread, and said coldly, "I don't eat things from strangers," then shut the door without another word. Trina stood still for a moment, loaf still in hand, then turned and walked straight home. Caleb had seen everything from across the street. He threw down his bike, ran over, eyes red. "Why do you even try with people like that?" he yelled. "They don't even see you as a person." Trina didn't turn around. She only said, loud enough for him to hear, "We survive by yielding, not by winning." Caleb was silent. That wasn't something Boone had ever taught from his rule books. Boone arrived just then. He had been about to knock on Trina's door when he saw it all unfold. He didn't intervene, just watched. His eyes settled on Trina's face. Long, angular, her gaze still steady, but something inside was cracking. Boone understood that feeling. Not shame, but familiarity with it, the feeling of trying to make peace with a place that doesn't want you. As Trina went inside, Boone said to Caleb, "You just learned a lesson that it took me over 30 years to understand." Caleb didn't answer. He just gripped the book in his hands tightly, the Constitution Boone had given him last week. He no longer saw it as a theory, but as a dull sword needing to be sharpened. Boone said nothing more to Trina, but for the first time, he didn't just see her as a single mother trying to raise her son. He saw a warrior, one who chose not to carry a sword but refused to step back. The dirt road to the repair shop was just over 2 kilometers. But that day Boone and Caleb were crossing an invisible border. The sun was mild, grass yellowing on both sides, dry wind sweeping across the cracked road. Boone walked slowly with his cane. Caleb carried a backpack and fired off questions about the Constitution and civil rights. With each answer, Caleb nodded as if etching it into memory. As they neared a bend, a white SUV parked beside an old fence started its engine and tailed them. The woman behind the wheel glanced at them through sunglasses, phone to her ear. Boone noticed but said nothing. Caleb didn't notice at all. Less than 5 minutes later, a blue and white patrol car came from the opposite direction, speeding too fast for a quiet road. It skidded to a halt, blocking the way. 2 officers stepped out, one young holding a radio, the other older and stockier, hand resting casually on his holster. "Stop right there. Let's see some ID, both of you." Boone squinted. "What's the reason?" The younger officer answered. "We received a report of a black child being lured by a suspicious man. Possible abduction. We're here to verify. This child's name is Caleb. I'm Jeremiah Boone. We're walking to the auto shop. He lives with his mother, Trina Jones. Number 46 Maple Hollow. Do you have ID?" "No, I don't carry a wallet for a short walk. And the boy isn't the subject of any investigation." The older officer stepped forward. His hand stayed on the gun, thumb unclipped. "You're refusing to show ID?" he said, voice sharp. Boone stayed calm. "I'm refusing without a legal basis. If there's a specific crime you suspect, I'll cooperate. If this is just a friendly check, I have the right to decline." The young officer hesitated, glanced at his partner, then stepped back and muttered into the radio. Boone turned to Caleb and spoke gently. "When you've done nothing wrong, you don't need to be afraid, but when the law is used to enforce fear, you need to remember to ask why." Caleb didn't answer. He was staring at the older officer's hand, still on the gun. The heavy silence dragged on for another 2 minutes, before the younger officer gave a nod and signaled retreat. But before getting into the car, he turned, pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the license plate on Boone's nearby truck. Then, almost inaudibly, said, "We'll be keeping an eye on you." The patrol car drove away, leaving the 2 of them in the dust. Boone said nothing. He just kept walking, like no one had just threatened to shoot him in broad daylight. Caleb caught up. After a while, he said, "So, you don't teach law so we can follow it, but so it doesn't swallow us whole." Boone stopped, turned to him. "No one teaches you to bow your head. You learn how to hold it high and still survive." They kept walking. Up ahead was the repair shop with its rusted tin roof, but for the first time, to Caleb, the law no longer looked like a book. It looked like a line between freedom and a wound. Jeremiah Boone rarely left his house unless absolutely necessary, but this morning he needed to replace a saw blade, buy a few bags of soil, and pick up a new hose for the backyard garden. His old silver pickup truck, loaded with heavy tools, rolled out of Maple Hollow just as the morning mist was lifting. The road to the town center was quiet. with only a few delivery trucks heading in the opposite direction. Boone switched on his old AM radio. A broadcaster was revisiting the news of a fire at the county records facility years ago, a story that barely caught public attention, but for Boone, it was an alarm bell. As he neared the intersection leading into Main Street, a patrol car lit up red and blue behind him. Boone pulled over, turned off the engine, and rolled down his window. The officer stepped out, a young, tall, white man with a nameplate reading, Officer Doyle. He walked up without haste, but his eyes scanned with a familiarity as if he'd seen something recognizable. "Good morning, sir. We noticed your left tail light looks a bit dim. Just a quick check." Boone looked in the rearview mirror. The light was fully functional. No issue. He turned calmly toward the officer and said, "Is that so? I checked it last week. But all right. Go ahead and do your job." Officer Doyle didn't check the light. Instead, he glanced inside the vehicle, a quick look, then back, almost as if waiting for Boone to say something more. "What's your name, sir?" Boone frowned. "I think you should tell me what law I've broken before asking for my ID." The officer gave a strained smile. "I just need to verify." Then, as if stumbling through a rehearsed script, he blurted out, You're Boone, right? From Maple Hollow?" The air thickened. Boone turned fully toward him, locking eyes. "How do you know my name?" Doyle hesitated, then quickly looked down at his notepad. "We have records from a previous stop. Your information's still in the system." "But I wasn't cited, was I?" Boone asked, calm but with a sharp glint in his eye. "So, if there was no citation, no violation, what kind of system is keeping my name?" Doyle said nothing. He turned back to his patrol car in silence. Boone sat quietly for a moment, then pulled out his worn leather wallet. In a side pocket was an old laminated ID card. The gold lettering faded with time. Jeremiah Boone, United States Federal Judge, Ret Retent. He looked at it for a long moment before slipping it back into his wallet, not because he planned to flash it for intimidation, but because he knew its time had passed. Yet what it stood for, justice, principle, and truth, still remained, and he wasn't ready to bury those values with his old age. Doyle returned, handed back Boone's license and registration. No apology, just a curt nod. Before turning away, he muttered under his breath just loud enough, "Drive safe, Mr. Boone." The patrol car roared off in the opposite direction. Boone started his engine, but didn't drive immediately. He sat still in the cab, hand resting on the steering wheel, eyes no longer on the road, but fixed on the rearview mirror. It wasn't about the tail light. It was about someone reminding him, "We know who you are, and we haven't forgotten." When he got home, Boone crouched beside the tailpipe, a scratch, small, barely visible unless caught in the right light at the right angle, but he knew. It hadn't been there yesterday. He ran his finger gently along the chipped paint, uneven evidence of something installed using force. A small device, mounted quickly and cleanly, without needing permission. Boone stepped inside, retrieved an old metal box from a cabinet. He opened it, pulling out a matte black rectangular device with a tiny antenna, an RF scanner, once used to detect bugs or trackers. A relic, but still useful to someone who'd served at the federal level. He inserted batteries and switched it on. The signal lights flickered for a few seconds, then spiked unnaturally as he moved it toward the back of the truck. Boone nodded, not entirely surprising, but still a chilling confirmation. Inside his office, he picked up the landline and dialed an old number. A woman's voice came through after 2 rings. "Jeremiah, I need to run a list." Carolyn Diaz, an old colleague from Boone's days at the Department of Justice, now worked as an independent risk analyst, specializing in filtering internal data from local agencies. She didn't ask for details. "I'll send it in 10 minutes. And Jerry, if you've been flagged, it means someone at the county level named you specifically. The list isn't official, but it's dangerous. You know what I mean." Boone hung up and stepped onto the porch. The wind chime above clinked in the late afternoon breeze. Exactly 9 minutes later, his fax machine whirred to life. A thin sheet slid out, marked Compiled Watch List, County Level / Internal Only / Unauthorized Distribution Prohibited. Boone scanned it, stopping at line 17. Boone, J., Retired Judge, Potential Civil Unrest Catalyst, Monitor discreetly. He folded the paper, slipped it into an old envelope, and tucked it inside his Bible, not to hide, but to place it somewhere worthy of the truth it held. Behind him, Caleb stood silently in the doorway. No sound, but his eyes gave away what he'd just heard. Boone didn't need to turn around. He knew the boy had seen everything. A while later, as the two watered plants in the backyard, Caleb finally spoke, no hesitation. "Are they watching you because they're scared or because they hate you?" Boone set down the watering can, wiped his hands on his pants, then looked at him. "Sometimes those two things are more alike than you'd think. They fear what they don't understand, hate what they can't control." Caleb said nothing more, but he stood beside Boone longer than usual, eyes fixed on the far fence, right where someone could watch this house easily. He didn't ask another question, but his eyes were no longer those of a schoolboy. They were weighing whether to stay quiet or step into the game. Boone turned the faucet, shutting off the water. The evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and something older still, the lingering smell of a past that refused to die. The landline rang in the middle of the night like a slap against the sleep that had just begun to settle. Trina jolted upright, her eyes not yet adjusted to the dark. The clock read 2:14 a.m. She looked around the room. The phone kept ringing in dry, even intervals. She picked it up. The other end was silent for a second. Then came a man's voice, not loud but precise, as if reading out a verdict. 46 Maple Hollow, corner house, gray curtains. One mother, one kid. If you know what's good for you, keep your mouth shut. Then he hung up. No threats to kill, no shouting, no swearing, just the cold certainty of someone forecasting the inevitable. Trina stood frozen beside the phone. Sweat trickled down her neck. Quietly, she went to every door, checked the locks, slid the deadbolts, and inspected each window. 3 locks, 2 curtains, 1 old baseball bat next to the bed. She didn't sleep again that night. The next morning was gray but mild. Boone arrived early, as usual. Caleb was sharpening pencils on the porch, while Trina invited Boone into the kitchen. She poured tea, her hand slightly trembling, though her gaze held firm. Boone sat down, skipping formalities. He waited. "Someone called last night," Trina said hoarsely, her voice rough from lack of sleep. "No name, just recited my address, then told me to behave." Boone's face didn't change. He placed a hand on his teacup, staring into the bottom like it held the answer. "Did you call the police?" he asked. "You know I didn't," Trina replied. "Call who? The same people behind that phone?" Boone gave a slight nod, then answered, calm as if explaining a legal principle. "Threats are the cheapest tool the system has. It doesn't need a reason, just the knowledge that you're the last one not staying quiet." Trina looked at him. In her eyes was something mixed, fear and resignation, exhaustion and a refusal to surrender. Outside, Caleb sat silently, but he'd heard everything. He didn't rush in like kids usually did when afraid. He just stayed there, still as the shadow cast by the porch. As Boone left, Caleb walked a few steps behind him. He didn't ask about today's lesson. He only said, "If people are scared of my mom, that means she's doing something right, doesn't it?" Boone paused, turned toward him. It took a moment before he answered, "Maybe. Or maybe it means they know she won't be afraid much longer." Caleb looked him straight in the eyes. That answer didn't comfort him, but it made him grow a little. Boone continued toward his car. Behind him, Trina stood in the doorway, gripping an untouched cup of coffee. No goodbyes were exchanged, but they all understood a storm was coming, and no one had time to just sit and wait anymore. The morning began with a video circulating across social media, though Boone only found out when Caleb walked in, face a mix of excitement and confusion. "You're trending," the boy said, holding out his phone. The 37-second clip was blurry, but the voice was unmistakable. Boone, nearly 20 years younger, standing on a judge's bench, eyes locked on an officer giving testimony. His voice was sharp. "Justice does not bow to guns and uniforms. It only bows to the truth." The video had thousands of shares and comments. Some called him America's conscience judge. Others wrote he should have been on the Supreme Court. but not all were kind. Just an old man bitter at cops. Was a judge now just stirring up trouble. Past his prime and preaching. Boone set down his teacup and opened his laptop, logging into the encrypted inbox he and Carolyn Diaz had used back when they worked cases together. One new message waited. Video released. From anonymous account, IP linked to Withers' campaign network. Brace yourself, Jerry. Scott Withers. A familiar name. Son of Officer Vernon Briggs, the very man Boone had sentenced in his final case before retiring. Now, Withers was a rising candidate for Jasper County Sheriff, and clearly he was using everything at his disposal to smear Boone. Boone closed the laptop and walked to the small shed behind his cabin. In a corner, among old tools and lumber, sat a tin box of personal items from his courtroom days. He opened it and pulled out an old hammer with a chipped wooden handle. Then he took a thin wooden plaque, set it on the workbench, and began to chisel letters into the surface with a steel punch. Caleb sat on the porch step, watching silently. He'd never seen Boone work like this, hammer in hand, eyes unblinking, each strike landing with the weight of a truth long buried. When Boone finished the last word, he wiped the surface clean and blew away the dust. The message stood clear. Silence doesn't mean we can't speak. It means no one has listened. Caleb walked up, pointed at the words, and asked, "Where are you going to hang it?" Boone didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the wall, where an old photo frame hung slightly crooked, a picture of him and his wife, taken outside the federal courthouse in Atlanta the day he received the Medal of Freedom. "Somewhere people are forced to see it," he said, and asked themselves, who made someone like me go silent? Caleb nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the plaque, because in those words he saw more than just Boone. He saw his mother, he saw himself, and he saw all those who'd been forced to stay quiet just to avoid being labeled troublemakers. Outside, the clouds had begun to gather. The wind was shifting. Boone knew the coming rain would wash away more than dead leaves. It would strip the masks off the rot that power had long hidden. That morning, the sky was suspiciously clear. Heavy rain the night before had left thick streaks of red mud under the sapodilla tree Boone still tended by hand. He wore rubber boots, holding a hose, gently spraying the freshly turned soil in slow, steady arcs. It was a quiet, slow task, and the kind that could be interrupted without warning. The crunch of tires on gravel echoed from the front of the house, prompting Boone to look up. He wasn't expecting anyone, let alone hoping for anyone. A white pickup truck with obscured plates parked in the middle of the driveway. Its doors opened at once, and 3 men stepped out. Jasper County police officers in uniform, radios on their shoulders, holstered weapons at their backs, faces devoid of emotion. The man in front spoke curtly. "We received a report of a suspicious individual in this area. Please remain still for questioning." Boone turned off the hose, set it down, and walked toward the fence, stopping just short of crossing his own property line. He squinted. "I live here. My name is Jeremiah Boone. Do you have a search warrant?" The police didn't answer his question directly. Instead, their posture and tone made it clear. In a wealthy white neighborhood, a black man was inherently suspicious. The second officer pulled out a notebook and began writing something down. The third, youngest, stepped forward, hand resting on his belt. "We're asking you to cooperate. If you don't, we'll be forced to take more direct measures." Boone remained calm. "I don't oppose you doing your job, but I have the right to know the legal grounds for being labeled suspicious, and I am currently standing on land I own, which is fully registered under my name." Before he could finish, the young officer lunged forward, shoving Boone hard by the shoulder, forcing him back against the wooden fence. "On your knees, now," he barked, voice tight with tension. Boone didn't move. His hands were still wet from the hose. The soil beneath his feet gave way slightly, mud clinging to his boots like it wanted to drag him down. He spoke slowly, eyes locked on the officer in front of him. "I am unarmed. I've broken no laws, and I have no obligation to kneel before those who do not understand the law." It was that composure that unbalanced them. The older officer gave a slight nod, a signal. The other 2 moved in simultaneously. One grabbed Boone's shoulders, the other kicked his legs out from behind. Boone collapsed. His knees slammed into the still wet ground. Mud splattered across his sleeves. His face scraped against the fence and was left bleeding. He didn't make a sound. Cold metal cuffs clamped around his wrists. These were the hands that once held a gavel to sentence the kinds of men who now forced him to kneel. The third officer's knee pressed into Boone's back, not hard enough to disable him, but just enough to hurt. Boone stared at the dirt, brown, dense, sticky, and for the first time in many years, he remembered the smell of a jailhouse floor, a memory once left behind, but never dead. As the cuffs clicked shut, Boone said, just loud enough for them to hear, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." It wasn't a threat, just a fact. From behind Trina's curtain across the street, Caleb stood frozen. He didn't know when he'd picked up his phone, only that his fingers were trembling as he hit record. The small screen captured Boone being forced to his knees in the yard, mud splattered across his clothes, arms twisted behind him, his face nearly touching the ground. It looked like the protest videos he'd seen online, except this time it was happening in front of his eye. An elderly neighbor across the road, Donald, with his silver hair, stepped out of his house upon hearing the noise. He shouted, "What's going on? That man lives there." But one of the officers turned sharply, hand on his gun, yelling, "Back off! Interfering is a crime!" Donald froze, arms raised, mouth agape. Slowly he backed away and shut the door, a living witness to the kind of silence society encourages. Boone didn't resist. He let them wrench his arms behind him. Mud streaked his neck. His face was dirty, but his eyes remained open, looking upward at the overcast sky. His gaze wasn't angry, it wasn't afraid. It was cold and still, like a lake drained of water. One officer rummaged through Boone's pocket and pulled out an old leather wallet. He flipped through its contents until he stopped. His eyes changed. He slowly pulled out a weathered plastic card, the corners worn but the lettering still clear. United States Federal Judge Rhett Jeremiah Boone. Boone didn't have to look. He already knew that feeling. Recognition, shock, and the cost of quick decisions made by men who assumed someone had no worth beyond the color of their skin. "God damn," one of them muttered. "What do you think happens next?" The patrol car reversed to the roadside not far from Boone's house, its rear wheels slightly climbing the damp grass. The youngest officer, the one who had shouted, "Get on your knees," rushed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and hurriedly powered on the integrated tablet connected to the department's internal database. His hands trembled slightly as he typed, "Boone Jeremiah." It only took a few seconds for the screen to populate. An old government ID photo of Boone, black and white, sharp and unmistakable. Beneath it, the text read, "Federal Judge, Rhett versus Southern District Court, tenure 19862010. A list of past cases appeared below, including an internal link to a landmark ruling, United States versus Vernon Briggs. His eyes stopped when a red triangle icon lit up in the corner of the screen, stark against the blue background. Judicial Protection Flag, Level 1. Beneath it, a warning. Previously under federal protective designation, any contact, surveillance, or engagement must be authorized at the federal level. He exhaled hard, backed away from the screen, and sweat soaked through the collar of his shirt. He got out of the vehicle quickly and walked over to where the other two officers were speaking in hushed voices. His words stumbled out. We just cuffed a federal judge. Retired. It's in the system. He's under federal protection." The other two froze. The eldest clenched his fists like he'd just been slapped. "You sure?" he asked, no longer hiding the fear in his voice. "I read the words with my own eyes. Not guessing," the younger man replied. "Name, photo, title, red flag, it's all there." They stood there in silence for a few seconds. The wind stirred the trees above, their rustling leaves sounding almost like laughter. One of them reached for the radio to call it in, but the third officer immediately stopped him. "You call this in and we're done. It goes on the record, then comes the review, the body cam poll, the formal report. You want the FBI debriefing us?" No one answered. The three men looked at each other, faces as pale as ash. One of them sat heavily on the porch step, head in his hands. Another turned away, staring off toward the woods. But it didn't matter where they looked. There was no way to turn back the clock 3 minutes, to the moment when their knee was still pressed into a man they thought was just some cranky old black guy. The older officer gritted his teeth. "Uncuff him. Now." The sound of the cuffs unlocking was colder than the wind. They helped him up, hands shaking, mouths fumbling something that resembled an apology, but Boone either didn't hear or didn't care to. He stood tall, knees still caked in mud, wrists red from the pressure of the restraints. He took his ID back, slipped it into his wallet, his gaze never leaving the men in front of him. Inside the house, Boone still hadn't come out, but he didn't need to. The atmosphere had shifted completely. No sirens, no official declarations, yet the 3 officers had just trapped themselves in a courtroom of their own making, one with no right to appeal. And Caleb, standing a few meters away, phone still in hand, kept recording, not out of revenge, but because someone needed to see what had just happened. Caleb sat alone in his room, curtains drawn, with only the light from his laptop screen reflecting off his intensely focused face. He had watched the video at least 5 times, each replay making his palms sweat more. Boone was pinned down, handcuffed, face in the mud, while 3 officers stood frozen, startled by the judge's ID card. Every detail was crystal clear. No one could claim it was a misunderstanding or fabrication. Caleb encrypted the file and made 2 backups. One on a small USB attached to his keychain. Another uploaded to an anonymous cloud storage. He hadn't learned this in school, but from Boone himself, the man who taught him that preserving the truth can sometimes be more important than saying it at the right time. That afternoon, when Boone arrived, Caleb invited him into his room. For the first time, a move initiated by the boy. Boone sat down, said nothing, and simply watched the screen. Caleb hit play. Boone didn't blink, didn't interrupt. He watched it from beginning to end in complete silence. When the screen dimmed, Boone nodded and softly said, "Don't release it yet, but don't let it disappear." Caleb asked, "Can I really trust the adults to handle this?" Boone looked at him and furrowed his brow. Caleb answered his own question. "I didn't record it for revenge. I recorded it because I don't believe anyone else will say exactly what happened." Trina entered the room, still holding a dish towel. When she saw the paused frame of Boone being forced down, her face went pale. "Turn it off. Delete it now, Caleb," she nearly shouted. "They'll find it and they'll put it all on you." Caleb stepped back, about to argue, but Boone placed a hand on her shoulder. Not forcefully, but firmly enough. The boy didn't do anything wrong. He just did what many adults were once too afraid to do. Trina looked at him, then at her son. Her eyes still filled with worry, but her lips no longer trembled. "We'll keep it," she said quietly, "but no one can know he was the one who recorded it. No one." After Trina left, Caleb pulled out a leather notebook and began documenting the date, time, steps taken, and who had seen the video. Boone stood beside him, silent, as if witnessing an oral testimony that needed no jury. That boy, just 12 years old, had stepped into a battle no one had asked him to fight, but he entered it anyway, by choice. Before leaving, Boone reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old notebook. Worn cover, corners curled from age. He flipped to a blank page, uncapped a fountain pen, and wrote, slowly, deliberately, Day 14, first witness, Caleb. No exclamation mark, no praise, just a line of affirmation, because the truth, when recorded, needs no applause. It only needs not to be buried. 2 days after the incident, Caleb kept his promise. The video remained unpublished. Boone's identity remained undisclosed, and all files were stored separately. But every plan has a blind spot. During lunch break, his classmate Malik borrowed Caleb's laptop to revisit an old video game clip. Malik accidentally stumbled across a file named G14_UU-cache.mp4 in a folder labeled Extra Classes. Instinctively, like any child born into the age of social media, he clicked play. His eyes widened with each frame. When it ended, Malik looked up and whispered, "Can I post this? I won't say who recorded it or who's in it. Just let people see it." Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "But don't name anyone. No music. Don't make it look like a show." Malik uploaded the video to a regional high school forum, a mostly obscure corner of the internet filled with cat photos, bike pics, and teacher memes, but within 3 hours, the video was re-uploaded to Twitter/X by an account that tracked police misconduct. 6 hours later, it had surpassed 50,000 views. The reposts were unedited. No soundtrack, no captions, no cuts. Just raw footage, as it was captured, of an old black man being forced to his knees and handcuffed in his own yard by 3 officers. No screaming, no resistance, just a man who wouldn't bow, and a gaze that never broke from the one demanding submission. Comments flooded in. A former federal attorney wrote, "This isn't just misconduct, this is a crime enabled by the system." A retired state Supreme Court judge from Michigan commented, "If I'm not mistaken, this man presided over the Briggs case in 2009. Then an Iraq War veteran added, "I saw him once at the National Constitutional Law Summit. He doesn't bow because he once stood for a nation's law." Other comments emerged too. Mockery, attacks, distortions. Just another clout-chasing stunt. That's what happens when you don't respect the cops. But they were drowned out by a growing wave of outrage from people who didn't even know who Boone was, only that something felt deeply wrong when a man like that was treated like a criminal. Caleb read every response, not for fame, but to understand how the world reacted. He wasn't proud, nor afraid. He just felt his spine a little straighter, his hand holding the phone no longer trembling. He turned off the Wi-Fi, closed the app, and set the phone down, as if finishing his first witness statement. At that same moment, in the small house in Maple Hollow, Boone's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No name, no signature. Just one simple line. "We know what happened, and this time, it won't be buried." Ever since the video surfaced online, the phone in Boone's house had hardly stopped ringing. Unknown numbers from New York, Los Angeles, and even Europe. They called, texted, emailed with urgent, lucrative offers. "We want to hear your story. We promise to honor the truth. We'll send an advance payment for exclusive rights." Boone didn't respond to a single one. He opened emails, read the subject lines, then deleted them. His phone stayed on silent, the alert light blinking feverishly like it had caught a fever. But Boone remained unmoved, not out of pride, but because he knew. His silence carried more weight than any carefully edited interview ever could. Trina saw that, but it didn't put her at ease. One evening, she sat with Boone in the small kitchen, eyes fixed on the television replaying the news. "The man in the video has been identified as a former federal judge," the anchor declared, with more enthusiasm than necessary. "You should say something," Trina said quietly. "If you don't, they'll shape you into whatever they need, a victim, a hero, or a rebel." Boone shook his head, eyes on his teacup. "I used to deliver verdicts with words," he said slowly. "Now, I want silence to be the verdict." Caleb heard that as he passed by the porch. He stopped behind the partially opened door, then stepped inside and asked in a low voice, "But what if they twist your story, sir? What if they say you're anti-police or trying to shame the system?" Boone turned to look at him, not angry, not amused, just calm. "The truth doesn't need to fight over a microphone," he replied. "It just needs to outlive the noise." Caleb didn't fully understand, but he nodded. The answer didn't comfort him, but it made him fall silent out of respect. Boone spent most of the following days in the small study behind his house. On the desk lay old copies of the Briggs case files, faded ink, paper yellowed by time. He used a fountain pen to rewrite the entire case by hand. Each hearing, each testimony, every detail he once suspected but never had time to fully investigate. Not to publish, but to complete. Because some things in life, if no one finishes them properly, should never be allowed to end wrongly. Outside, the media screamed on. Talk shows dissected him. Commentators praised, mocked, questioned, and glorified, but all of it revolved around one fact. Boone said nothing, and that silence made him the center of attention, a center he never wanted but could no longer avoid. And he knew when people start waiting for a response from someone who's remained silent, it means they're finally ready to listen, not for headlines, but because they've started to think. Boone closed the handwritten file, blew the invisible dust from the cover. On the last page, he wrote, "An ending is not a period. It's the moment someone knows they must reread from the beginning." He didn't know who would read it. He wasn't sure anyone would dare to continue it, but he believed at least one person was learning how to do it, a 12-year-old boy who knew when not to turn off the camera. Boone was sitting on the back steps, holding the notebook on the Briggs case, when he heard a knock at the front door. Not hurried, not frantic, just 3 even, deliberate taps. He got up and walked around. At the door stood a young Asian woman, hair tied back, pale gray coat, holding nothing but a thin folder. She didn't give her name, didn't flash a press badge. She simply placed the file on the doorframe and asked, "Why haven't you spoken?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, it wasn't probing, just a question, like she'd been waiting a long time to ask the right person at the right time. Boone looked at her, unblinking. He didn't answer. He simply stepped back and closed the door. But as he glanced at the folder she'd left behind, his eyes froze on the cover, a full printout of United States versus Vernon Briggs, 2009, with a handwritten note, Revision 6, annotations from deposition transcripts. Tucked beneath it was a thin book, The Law That Forgets, author Lee May. Boone remembered that name. She was the one banned from courtrooms by a state judge for exposing the backdoor relationship between a chief justice and a political fund. After the ban, she never reapplied to another paper. She just blogged independently, interviewing witnesses with no camera. 5 minutes later, Boone opened the door again, not out of curiosity, but out of respect for someone who asked the right question. Lee May was still there, no phone, no notebook. She stepped inside, not looking around like a journalist, but like someone trying to set down a heavy memory. They sat across from each other. No tea tray, no fancy chairs, just 2 wooden seats on the porch. She spoke first. "I'm not here to interview you. I came because I don't believe your silence is out of fear. I believe you're holding on to an oath everyone else has forgotten." Boone looked up at her for a long time, then nodded gently. "They think I'm quiet because I'm weak. But I once told myself, if I have to shout to be heard, then the law has lost its voice." Lee May didn't interrupt. She let him continue, or not. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour. Not a single word about the police, not a single question like, how did it feel to be handcuffed? Instead, when you sentenced Briggs, were you sure you were right? When you lost your power, did it feel like relief or regret? Have you ever thought you stayed silent too long? Boone didn't answer every question, but his eyes began to change. Not the eyes of a judge who'd seen too much deceit, but the eyes of a man facing someone who stood upright, without needing anything to lean on. As Lee May stood to leave, Boone stopped her briefly and pointed to the wooden bookshelf in the corner. "There's an unfinished transcript up there. If you want, read it, but don't publish yet. Don't let the truth get boxed in just because it came too early." Lee May nodded. As she left, she didn't take photos, didn't ask for quotes. She simply said, "I write to clarify, not to sensationalize." Boone stood still, watching her walk down the grassy path without looking back. For the first time since the incident, he felt something unfamiliar. His silence had finally been heard by someone who never asked him to break it. Boone's bedroom had remained untouched for over a decade. The low oak dresser in the corner still sagged slightly from years of humidity, yet he had never replaced it. He rarely touched the bottom drawer. It wasn't locked, just tightly shut. Inside were things no one disturbed, not out of restriction, but because no one even knew they still existed. Boone sat down, gently pulled the drawer. The creak of wood against dry metal rails sounded like a complaint from a past forced to wake up. A small wooden box lay quietly amid faded letters, yellowing envelopes, and photographs warped by light. Boone picked up the box and opened it. Under the dim yellow lamp, a silver-plated medal shimmered softly. Around its circular edge, embossed words read, "Civilian Valor, for courage without badge. It was the medal the Department of Justice had once awarded his wife, Eleanor Boone, after she was killed in broad daylight, in the middle of a street, trying to stop an officer from wrongfully detaining a young black teen waiting at a bus stop. Boone had never told Caleb. He had never mentioned it to Trina either, not because he didn't want to, but because he hadn't yet forgiven himself for not being there that day, for not being able to override the court's decision to dismiss his motion for judicial review of the officer's case. The reason given was short, personal conflict of interest. Boone didn't object, but he knew the truth. They simply didn't want a grieving judge questioning the integrity of a fellow man in uniform. He lifted the medal, his hand trembling slightly. The back of it was engraved, Eleanor May Boone, 9, 602011. She stood when others froze. The etching was deep but worn now. Boone stared at it for a long time. Then he set it down and moved the old photos beneath. One showed her standing in front of the courthouse, holding the medal high, a smile unable to mask eyes swollen from crying. Another was a copy of a thank you letter from the Office of the Attorney General. Beautiful words, but hollow. Not a single line acknowledged that the officer who fired 3 shots into Eleanor had been acquitted for lack of malicious evidence. Boone closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened the second drawer. From it, he pulled a folder marked in faded red ink, Case Archives C. Reese, Internal Only. He flipped to the first page and saw the familiar name, Clayton Reese, the man who had shot his wife. And now that name had surfaced again in an internal file, this time listed as a security campaign advisor for candidate Scott Withers, currently running for sheriff of Jasper County. Boone stood up, carried the file to his desk, and laid out the pages. No trembling, no rage, just one thing was clear in his eyes. His silence had reached its final boundary. This was no longer about personal grief, no longer about a private loss. It was repetition, and if he didn't speak now, he would become part of those enabling it to happen again. Boone sat before his old computer. A soft click sounded as the external drive sent by Carolyn was plugged in. It contained extracts from Jasper County's internal security archives, something only those with former federal clearance could access. He entered his personal security code, then typed Clayton Reese. No results. He wasn't surprised. He tried again with altered syntax. Reese, Clayton. Still nothing. Only when he typed C.R. Halton, the name listed in the Security Campaign Advisor records, did a hidden file appear, buried deep in the encrypted directory, marked with an internal flag icon. Boone opened the file. Portrait photo, military record, training history. It all matched Clayton Reese. The man had legally changed his name 8 years ago, after receiving an early retirement payout for occupational psychological trauma following the 2011 shooting. A note in the document read, not to re-engage in official law enforcement capacity, but permitted to operate as internal strategic consultant. In other words, no longer armed but still shaping those who are. And now, Reese was aiding another man, Scott Withers, to rise into command over the entire county's law enforcement system. Boone leaned back, eyes fixed on the words, Strategic Risk Advisor, C.R. Halton / formerly Reese, Clayton, clearance level B / file access restricted under municipal override. They hadn't erased his name, only replaced it. But paper, especially old paper, doesn't forget. Just then Caleb walked in, holding 2 glasses of water, and froze at the door. He saw Boone sitting still, eyes red, papers spread across the table. He glanced at the screen, then quietly placed the glasses down. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked softly. Boone didn't answer. Caleb peeked at the file name, then whispered, "Was she someone you loved?" Boone didn't nod right away, but he didn't deny it. After a long pause, he closed his eyes, then tilted his head, nodded. Caleb asked no more, but for the first time he understood more than any lesson Boone had ever taught, that some laws cannot be written, only preserved through memory, through tears and through the things we refuse to let vanish. Boone gathered the documents again, page by page, as though preparing a funeral for a past never buried. He was no longer angry. Only one thing remained clear in his voice, calm but cold. I no longer stay silent because of the law. I speak now because they've twisted it beyond recognition. Carolyn Diaz arrived without warning. Her silver-gray SUV pulled up silently to the gate, so quietly that Caleb, who was watering plants, didn't even notice. It wasn't until 3 crisp, deliberate knocks echoed through the door that Boone stood up and slowly walked out. When he opened the door, the light from the hallway fell upon a familiar face. Her hair now grayer, the wrinkles deeper, but her eyes still sharp, just like the last day they stood together at a federal hearing. They didn't hug, they didn't shake hands, they just looked at each other for a long time, as if both were checking if the other was still alive, not by heartbeat, but by principle. Carolyn entered without ceremony. She placed a thick file case on the table and unzipped it slowly. "I think it's time to return something I never had the right to keep," she said, but couldn't bring myself to destroy. Boone sat down in silence. Carolyn pulled out a nylon-wrapped folder with a handwritten label, Eleanor Boone, Marshall/unmodified. Boone didn't touch it. He simply stared. "I thought that version disappeared in 2011, he said quietly. Carolyn replied, "It did for everyone except me." They began turning the pages. In the original statement from Witness 3, an elderly woman, she said, "I saw her raise both hands and say, 'This person did nothing,' but in the version the court used, it had been reduced to, 'She appeared to interfere.' The body cam footage that had originally run 7 minutes was trimmed down to 3 minutes and 48 seconds. The missing segment is exactly when the gunshot occurred," Carolyn pointed out. "I was suspended for 3 months for trying to access the original file from the internal system." She paused. "At the time, I still believed that if I was patient enough, justice would correct itself, but I nearly got divorced for refusing to falsify a report in the governor's trial in Jefferson County." Boone wasn't surprised, but his eyes darkened when they reached the ballistic report. In the original, the forensic technician clearly noted, "Bullet does not match the registered Glock 17 reported in use." In the final version, that line had vanished entirely. Carolyn looked up, locking eyes with Boone. "I don't trust the courts anymore, but I still trust paper. If I have the original, it doesn't lie." Boone closed the folder, his hand slightly trembling. He looked at Carolyn for a long moment, then asked, "Why did you keep this all these years?" Carolyn leaned back, pulling out a pack of cigarettes but not lighting one. "Because I know you. I knew you would never bury anyone without knowing the whole truth. And I also knew someday it would be you they tried to bury alive, if you didn't open the casket first." Outside the window, sunlight spilled onto the porch like it would over an empty courtroom. 2 aging figures, once at the center of American justice, now sat in a silent wooden house, surrounded by forgotten files, not to seek justice for someone already gone, but to prevent it from vanishing again. A diagram sketched in pencil on a piece of old brown paper sat on the table. Boone carefully marked each point by hand, where Eleanor stood, the position of the suspect targeted by police, the bullet's path, and where Officer Reese was, according to the official report. Carolyn stared at it for a moment, then laid down a black and white satellite print. Images from the traffic camera system that day, she pointed to the top right corner. "This is Reese's patrol car, but by the timeline in the report, he couldn't have been in this position and also fired the shot that hit Eleanor, unless—" She looked up. "The report time was altered." Boone nodded. "And the only person with the authority to alter that is the Rapid Response Division Chief." Carolyn smirked without amusement. "And you know who signed off on the final statement?" Boone flipped through the file. "The supervising officer who validated the report, now campaign manager for Scott Withers. Names long buried in memory returned, not as ghosts, but as puzzle pieces from a rotting map finally coming back together." They moved on to compare medical records. Carolyn pulled out a copy from the hospital. Eleanor's time of admittance, 1812, June 14, but in the forensic log her time of death was recorded as 1758, that same day. They altered it to imply she died before receiving care, Carolyn said, to dodge liability for mishandling emergency protocol. Boone exhaled heavily, placing his hand on the paper. A human being reduced to an irrelevant timestamp, a single line that erases an entire chain of events. Boone stared at the name Clayton Reese, the man who had been transferred 3 times in the year after Eleanor's death, across 3 different departments. No explanation, no paperwork, just an internal note. TT LVL 2A Ought, Carolyn explained. Temporary transfer, level 2, classified reason. Boone closed his eyes. Not classified for safety, classified for shame. A moment later, Carolyn took out a thick envelope. I submitted this anonymously in 2014. Everything inside. No response, no investigation. No one was summoned. Boone looked at the envelope but didn't open it. I'm not chasing justice anymore, Carolyn, he said. I just want to make public everything they tried to hide. So next time someone has to wipe blood off the floor, they can't erase the truth with it. Evening settled in. 2 aging souls, gray-haired, sleepless-eyed, still sat at the wooden table. Before them lay stacks of files, folders, medical certificates, forensic reports, and photographs. No jury, no prosecutor, no judge, but every page was a witness, and those 2, though stripped of any official title, were still trying a case that had never been tried. Boone sat beside Caleb on the wooden bench behind the house, where the last light of day slanted through the old tree's branches. The silence stretched until only the wind and dry leaves rustling underfoot remained. He didn't look at Caleb as he began to speak, as if the story wasn't for the boy, but for someone who had been waiting a long time to hear it. When Eleanor died, I wasn't there. I was presiding over a federal case in Atlanta. It couldn't be postponed. I couldn't leave. And that's haunted me for 10 years, not because I couldn't save her, but because I wasn't allowed to be there. His voice was hoarse, steady, without self-pity. The media said Eleanor interfered, shouted, and obstructed an officer. But the only person who ever told me the truth was a homeless woman. She used to live on the corner where it happened. She told me Eleanor didn't shout, didn't scream. She just stepped between the officer and the boy with a gun pointed at him, and said one thing, "Please, just look again." Boone paused, his hand tightening, and the officer didn't look again. He fired 3 times. Caleb said nothing, just sat still, eyes fixed on the backyard. Boone continued, eyes still locked on the sky ahead. 3 weeks later, the woman disappeared from the shelter. No one looked, no one asked, no name listed in the witness records. Just one line, unable to identify. Everyone thought Eleanor died because she interfered, but really she just wanted someone to stop for 5 seconds, to tell right from wrong. 5 seconds. Boone bowed his head for the first time in the conversation, not out of grief, but from the weight of a silence that had lasted too long. Caleb looked at him and asked softly, "So, have you ever forgiven yourself?" Boone looked up, not avoiding the question. "No, but I've learned this: never forgive too easily, like the system once did. Forgiveness must follow the truth, not come before it." A breeze stirred, bringing with it the damp scent of earth from the garden. Boone stood, went inside. A few minutes later he returned, holding a small, neatly folded handkerchief with frayed edges. He opened it. On the fabric was a faded, brown-red blood stain, still visible. "This is the only thing left from that day. Eleanor always carried it when she went out. She hated handbags." Boone looked at the cloth, then offered it to Caleb. "I don't need to keep it anymore, but I did, because some things the system tries to forget, and if no one remembers, then truth dies with it." Caleb didn't take the cloth, he just looked at him, his gaze no longer that of a child, and in that moment Boone understood. Memory doesn't need to be written in records, it only needs someone awake enough to keep it alive, day by day, generation to generation. On the wooden table in the living room sat an old leather-bound notebook, its spine already loose. Boone opened it with both hands, like unlocking a door to the past that only he still had the key to. Inside, each page was filled with slanted, steady handwriting. Every line bore a name. Beneath each was a note, not a resume, but a memory the system had refused to preserve. Boone read slowly, voice soft, nearly a whisper. Sandra Hill, ER nurse on duty that day, resigned after 4 months. Note, denied health insurance renewal. He flipped a page. James Lott, video technician, relocated to another state. Daughter changed schools due to threats. Carolyn sat beside him, clutching a cup of cold tea. She said nothing, just stared at those lines like she was attending a funeral for people who had once done the right thing and were punished not by verdict, but by deliberate erasure. Boone continued. Marta Reyes, court clerk, once sent me a handwritten letter saying Eleanor's case file had been interfered with from higher levels. Never saw her again. He paused on another page. Unnamed woman, final witness, note, no address, no ID, no one searched. Boone stopped, his eyes resting on a blank space between two names where one more name should have been, but there was no one left to fill it. Carolyn finally spoke, her voice no longer firm as usual. They erased all of them from the system. No lawsuits, no case IDs. Every trail was cut short. But you held on to it because you still believe a handwritten page sometimes outlives a deletion order. Boone didn't nod, nor did he reject it. He simply closed the notebook, as if sealing a file that never existed but never disappeared. Caleb walked into the room just as Boone placed the notebook on the table. He saw the look in Boone's eyes. Not anger, not bitterness, just the exhaustion of a man who had carried the memory of a corrupted system on his back for over a decade. Why did you write all those names down? Caleb asked quietly. Boone didn't respond right away. He placed his hand on the notebook, gently smoothing its frayed edge, not to present in court, but to remind others. The truth was once here. It's just been locked outside the margins of history. Before rising, Boone looked Caleb straight in the eyes, his gaze flickering not with hope, but with trust. You see, he said slowly, some names don't need to be honored. They just need not to be forgotten. Outside the window, the sun was setting behind the trees. Its last light shone on the notebook on the table, a thing no system preserved, no court acknowledged. Yet it existed, like the quietest testimony from a trial that was never held. The Jasper County Criminal Records Center sat tucked behind a 3-meter chain-link fence, its gray brick walls mottled with moss, looking no different from an old industrial warehouse. Lee May arrived just before noon. The sun was blazing, but inside the compound there was a lingering scent. Smoky, burnt, damp. A makeshift sign hung at the gate, temporarily closed due to technical incident, authorized personnel only. No news outlets had reported a fire. Not a single official line. But that only made her gut feeling sharper. Something had just been erased, and not with a keyboard. Lee May circled around to the back, where an old ambulance ramp was often used to move documents. Part of the brick wall was scorched. The outer steel door remained closed, but the metal was warped inward, like it had been hit with intense heat. She looked up. The third-floor window, where the restricted access files were kept, was cracked and scorched black. There was no mistaking it. Carolyn had once said this was the original archive for body cam footage and internal reports from the Eleanor case. A middle-aged security guard walked by. Lee May caught up and quietly asked him a question. At first, he shook his head, claimed to know nothing, but when she said the name Boone, his eyes changed. I can't say anything on the record, he whispered. Just know there was no fire alarm, no sign of electrical faults. The fire started inside the third-floor room, and it didn't spread. But everything in there turned to ash. Lee May looked him in the eyes. You know, don't you? Fire doesn't choose which files to burn. Someone wanted it to burn. The guard stayed silent, then turned away, leaving the thought hanging in the air. Standing in front of the scorched steel door, a chill crept up Li Mei's spine. This was no accident, no misstep. It was a message, one no longer wearing a mask. She pulled out her phone, turned on the camera, and took a series of photos, each burn mark, each smudged wall, every detail proving one thing. Someone was using fire in place of a delete key. No more hiding behind procedure. No more pretending it was an oversight. On the ride back, she didn't turn on the radio. No podcasts. No notes. She just opened her messages, typed in Boone's number, and sent a short line with the photos attached. "Boone, they've started erasing for real." The phone didn't buzz back, but she knew he was reading, and she knew that from now on, they couldn't wait for a system to self-correct. They would have to rewrite the entire truth before it turned to ash. Boone received Li Mei's message at 2:07 p.m. No exclamation point, no dramatics. Just 4 words. "They've started erasing for real." He read it again and again, hand resting on the edge of the desk. Across from him, Carolyn was reviewing backup files from the Eleanor case. When she saw Boone's face darken, she didn't need to ask. "It burned?" Boone nodded. "3rd floor, no fire alarm, no news coverage." Carolyn exhaled. That was the only place holding the original internal investigation report. She stood, went to the next room, and came back with a rubber-coated USB stick. "Luckily, I made a backup here. It's not the full archive, but it's over 60%. The main report, some forensic photos, and the names of the original investigators." Boone took it and plugged it into his computer. In the dim light of the room, the files they'd once been denied came back like witnesses who didn't need questioning, only acknowledgement. Caleb entered the room, seeing the 2 adults wrapped in silence. "Something wrong?" he asked. Boone turned, voice gravelly but steady. "They burned the original evidence room." Caleb's breath hitched. "So, if there's no paper, no video, what will you do?" Boone looked at him, eyes no longer holding the sadness Caleb had once known. "We still have testimony. We still have the living truth. That's enough to make them face it." Li Mei arrived near dusk. She brought printed photos of the scene, notes on the fire, and the guard's statement. In her hand was also a new notebook. Black cover, empty pages. Boone saw it and understood instantly. "We're rewriting it?" Li Mei nodded. Carolyn added, "Not like an article, like an indictment never filed." No one said more. Boone stood, drew the curtain, turned off the overhead light, and switched on a single desk lamp, just bright enough to illuminate every word they were about to write. On the first page, Li Mei wrote the title, "Eleanor Case, the report that never lived." Carolyn sat to the left, Boone to the right. One had written reports, one had handed down rulings, one had been silenced by the system. Now, the 3 elders of law, investigation, and journalism sat together not to accuse but to record every truth, every detail, every name, before someone could burn it all again. Caleb sat at Boone's old desk, the laptop resting on his knees, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. He was reviewing footage from the security camera mounted on the wooden post by the gate, an old black and white model, but still clear enough to capture movement. "Sir," he called, "I think someone—" Left the threat letter directly. It wasn't mailed. Boone stepped out from the other room, eyes locked on the screen. The video was time-stamped at 3:41 a.m. on the morning the anonymous letter appeared. A man in a long coat and baseball cap approached the gate, looked around, then bent down to slip something through the iron mailbox slot. Boone told Caleb to pause and zoom in. The cap shadowed the face, but when the man turned his head toward the street, just for a split second, his high cheekbones, straight nose, and slightly off-centered jawline were visible. Boone's gaze froze. Scott Withers. He didn't speak the name aloud, it simply escaped like a ghost from a corner of memory he had long kept locked away. Caleb looked up. "The sheriff candidate?" Boone nodded. "Son of David Withers." Carolyn had just entered the room and stopped in her tracks at the name. "David Withers, the falsified evidence case in 2005? You were the only judge who denied his appeal." Boone looked at her. his voice lower. "And I wrote in that ruling, this behavior does not merely taint an investigation, it poisons the entire public trust in the system." Carolyn frowned. Scott changed his last name during college, took his mother's, to avoid association with the case. "I remember he lost his scholarship for plagiarism. Then suddenly he got another one, sponsored by the Community Security Foundation, that far-right group that was once investigated for influencing police recruitment across the southern states." Boone didn't take his eyes off the screen. The way the man, now clearly identified as Scott, bent down to drop the letter felt intentional, familiar. He didn't cover his face. He wasn't afraid of being caught. He wanted me to see him. "This isn't a threat. It's a declaration." Boone looked at Caleb. "I used to think David Withers wasn't dangerous enough to raise someone worse." They replayed the video frame by frame, analyzing every step. The posture was confident, never hesitant. That letter had sat quietly in the iron box for days, but now, with every pixel sharpened, it emerged like a bullet chambered from the past, aimed in the present. And the one pulling the trigger this time wasn't the father. In the dimly lit room, the three of them faced a truth that didn't exist in records. Some people don't seek to restore justice. They want to rewrite who was guilty. Carolyn placed the laptop on the table and opened a file of campaign finance data from the State Election Commission. In it were Scott Withers's campaign expenses, hundreds of thousands of dollars listed for security consulting and internal media strategy. The firm's name was Bland, Halton Solutions, LLC, but Carolyn had already traced it. The CEO was Clayton R. Halton, the new name of Clayton Reese, the man who had killed Eleanor. Both Boone and Lee May stared at the screen. No one spoke. They all understood. The truth was no longer in the documents. It was now held by people rebuilding a machine for revenge, under the mask of reform. Scott Withers didn't come to fix the system. He came to take it, to erase those who once brought his father down. Lee May played a clip from Scott's recent speech at City Hall. On stage, he declared, "We don't need judges in ivory towers, reporters hiding behind recorders, or ex-investigators clinging to unverifiable claims. We need to rebalance the scales, eliminate those who built the walls between people and the law." Boone paused the video. That final line rang like a verdict, reaching backward in time. "That's not a campaign," Boone murmured. "It's a call to arms for the once condemned who never forgot." Carolyn added, "And Reese is the same old knife in a new sheath. He's using the exact method David Withers once did, plant the evidence in the right hands, then smear everything else." Caleb sat in silence, absorbing everything. His eyes landed on the video still of Scott placing the letter. So, if he's already started erasing files, inserting people into campaigns, rewriting everything, then what do we have left to fight back with? Boone turned to him, not smiling, but his voice was no longer heavy. "We have what he'll never have, living witnesses, memory unburned, and an indictment still." Lee May pulled up a blank screen. Carolyn began typing. Boone picked up his pen and opened the notebook. The first line of the document appeared. "Scott Withers, the heir of an error never corrected." None of the three needed to say it aloud. From this moment on, they were no longer just tracing the past. They were stepping into a war against a future engineered to repeat old mistakes, this time with more power and less resistance than ever before. Caleb sat alone in the corner of Boone's study, in front of an old computer screen. He was entering the license plate number of a patrol car that had appeared on the day of the assault. The number wasn't unfamiliar. He had saved it from the video footage of that day. Boone didn't know Caleb was doing this, but Caleb knew. If he wanted to honor what his mentor had taught him, the truth couldn't just stand outside and watch. He traced the radio ID, tracked the vehicle's route using a satellite-based public map one Boone had once told him about. If they didn't want to be tracked, they wouldn't have left the tools in the hands of the people. 2 of the 3 patrol cars that day weren't supposed to be anywhere near Boone's neighborhood. According to the shift assignments Carolyn had retrieved from the internal system, all 3 officers, Harris, Blake, and Montrell, were scheduled to patrol the east side of the city. Boone's area was well outside the Line 14 boundary. Caleb compared times, routes, and noticed something odd. All 3 vehicles left their base 28 minutes before their official shift, and each of them disabled their GPS for roughly 15 minutes, right at the time Boone was attacked. Carolyn double-checked the data and confirmed there were no dispatch requests for assistance anywhere nearby. They didn't act out of anger, she said, her voice steady as if addressing a jury again. They acted because they were allowed to be angry, and because they believed if something happened, no one would trace it back. Lee May sat quietly, then opened an encrypted email from an anonymous source, someone who had helped her investigate city-level misconduct before. Inside was a note from a meeting held on the 18th of the previous month, with a chilling bullet point. Issue: reestablish public limits around JB. Prevent the resurgence of the old firekeeper image. Boone sat at the tea table, listening in silence. His face showed no change, but his hands, resting on his knees, clenched slightly tighter with every sentence. Caleb stepped closer. "Did you already know this was coming?" Boone didn't answer right away. After a pause, he replied quietly, "I didn't know the day or the hour, but I've always known sooner or later the system would respond. Not with laws, but with bare hands." In the silence that followed, Boone pulled out a blank sheet of paper and placed it on the table. He took a pen and began writing, slowly and deliberately. Not a statement, not an accusation, just a single sentence, clear as a verdict on hypocrisy. It wasn't an accident, it was a message. And in that moment, all 3 of them, a boy, a journalist, and a former investigator, understood. This confrontation had never been just between people. It was between memory and a power trying to erase every trace of it. Carolyn sat in front of 2 open screens, one showing the internal patrol roster from the Jasper County Police Department server, the other a radio transmission file sent by an unnamed source. Each signal was coded in dispatch jargon, but the voice was unmistakable, gravelly, firm, and commanding. The voice said, 14A Delta, keep distance and if needed, neutralize. Carolyn stopped the recording, rewound, and froze the clip at the transmission's timecode. She turned to Boone. No signature, no written command, but every patrol unit heard it, and they all understood. Boone nodded slowly. This isn't a directive. It's a culture of command. They don't write it down. They leave blanks, so no one has to be held responsible. At that moment, Carolyn's phone vibrated. An encrypted message from a young officer who had once been her intern 5 years ago. It contained only one line. "I heard that order. It came over the radio. Coded. No one signed it, but everyone knew what it meant." Carolyn read it aloud, then set her phone down, as if placing a piece of evidence that no court would admit, but everyone knew was real. Lee May documented everything. "The deputy commander of Homeland Security was in that meeting last month," she said, reopening the leaked email. In the unclassified minutes was a side note. "Boone cannot be allowed to re-emerge as a symbol. Handle before any public appearance occurs." She looked up, calmly. "They don't want you dead. They want you disarmed, stripped of relevance." Boone gazed out the window. The sky had darkened. The fading light stretched across the wooden porch like smudged fingerprints on forgotten glass. He repeated the sentence, this time like a declaration. "If there's no file, they think there'll be no history. If no one writes it down, they think the story dies with the last person who remembers it." Carolyn printed the radio code transcript on a white sheet of paper and pinned it to the corkboard beside Boone's desk. Simple, cold symbols, no different from an administrative notice. 14 a Delta, keep distance and if needed, neutralize. She added nothing, no footnotes, no red marks. She left it exactly as it was broadcast in the system. No signature, no questions, no consequences. Boone stood in front of the sheet for a long time. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He only whispered, just loud enough for them to hear, "Next time, they won't need code words. They'll call me by name." And he knew when that time came, he would either be erased or he would be the last one left to read aloud everything they had tried to burn into ash. The broadcast had been announced since early morning. WXN, one of the state's biggest television networks, touted it as a special live interview with Sheriff candidate Scott Withers, currently leading in public opinion polls. Boone's living room was silent as the image appeared. Scott, seated in a dark-toned studio, wearing a well-fitted suit, a small pin on his lapel, and a smile that was perfectly polite but cold. Beside him was the famous Emmy-winning host, just about to launch into the direct question segment. The first question didn't pull punches. "Mr. Withers, can you explain why a former federal judge was arrested in his own backyard in a viral video, and why multiple sources claim it was a coordinated act?" Scott smirked slightly, responding smoothly, "I think we live in an era where anyone can become a victim of selective misunderstanding. Mr. Boone is a relic, a figure from another time. And sometimes, relics don't know when to step off the stage." He raised his chin, eyes looking straight into the lens. "And that video? A fragment with no context. Everyone knows how easy it is to edit footage these days. Like retouching a photo." Boone didn't move. Sitting on a wooden chair with Carolyn and Lee May, his eyes remained fixed on the screen. It was the second question that truly dropped the room into silence. The host asked, "Are you aware that Clayton Reese, the man previously accused in a 2011 shooting, now serves as a security strategy advisor for your campaign?" Scott tilted his head slightly, blinked once. "I have no direct ties to anyone with unresolved legal histories. Strategic staff often come through subcontractors, and I don't oversee that level of delegation." He took a sip of water, just enough to break the tension and regain control. Carolyn jotted something in her notebook. "He didn't deny outright, just deflected responsibility. A rehearsed line." Lee May nodded. "And he never said Reese's name. That's the move of someone who knows exactly who he's avoiding." On screen, Scott kept smiling, redirecting the conversation to restoring trust between law enforcement and the public, repeating campaign slogans without a single concrete fact. Boone finally spoke, very softly, almost whispering. "When someone answers that quickly, it means they've practiced the script." He turned off the TV before the interview ended, not because he didn't want to hear more, but because he'd heard enough. The method of denial wasn't as important as the preparation to deny, and today Boone realized Scott wasn't there to engage. He was there to rewrite history, starting with sanitizing the truth using a broadcast. 2 days after the live interview, the name Boone flooded social media, not because people were listening to the truth, but because ridicule had gone viral. A short, edited clip spread like wildfire. Boone on his knees in the mud, head down, captioned, "The old law has fallen." That image turned into memes, stickers, and even background music for mocking videos. Caleb scrolled through it, his fingers tightening around the phone. He had never seen cruelty spread so fast, or Boone turned into a symbol, not of justice, but of a bygone era. Boone said nothing. He didn't return media calls, didn't respond to reporters, didn't post a defense. Carolyn, concerned, asked, "You're not going to say anything? Not even to defend your image?" Boone shook his head, voice calm. "They're not attacking my dignity. They're testing my patience. If I react, I'm the angry old man. If I stay silent, I'm pitiful. But if I wait, then I'll be the one left holding the truth." Lee May closed her laptop after printing hundreds of polarizing comments from small stations and independent journalists. She pointed to a tweet from a retired judge in New Jersey. "Boone may be old, but if he speaks, I'll be the first to stand beside him." Then she turned to Caleb and said, "They're testing him through public opinion, not to refute him, but to make him self-destruct from exhaustion." Caleb looked over at Boone, now labeled delusional judge, old liar, justice leech. He said nothing, but his eyes asked a single question. Why stay silent when the world is screaming? Boone understood. He placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder and answered softly, "Some truths don't need shouting. They just need to be repeated at the right moment by someone they can't buy or intimidate." That evening, the room was quiet again. No more TV lights. Only Boone, Carolyn, Lee May, and Caleb were sitting around the old wooden table. In front of them was a draft report titled, "The Eleanor Report: What the System Forgot." They weren't writing to strike back. They were writing to endure. Like a quiet manuscript for a generation yet to come, those who might not know who Boone was, but would one day know that someone was once forgotten for telling the truth in a time that punished it. Boone looked up, his gaze no longer heavy. He didn't need cameras, didn't need pity. He just needed to protect the one thing the system hadn't yet burned, memory. And he knew the battle hadn't begun. It was simply choosing whom to trust, not to kneel. The door to the third-floor boys' restroom slammed open. Caleb was shoved backward against the tiled wall, surrounded by 4 students, all taller, stronger, and carrying expressions that didn't bother to hide their malice. No preamble, no justification. A fist landed straight into his stomach, then a hissed curse through clenched teeth. "Piece of shit! Your family humiliated the police." Caleb didn't react. He didn't cry, didn't scream. He just braced himself, lips tightly pressed together. When the teacher entered, they scattered as quickly as they had come. Caleb was taken to the nurse's office, cheek split, arm bruised, but he sat upright, head held high. Trina arrived 12 minutes after receiving the call, expecting to see her son. Instead, she was led straight into a conference room. The principal and 2 school security officers were waiting, faces drained and evasive. "We need to temporarily suspend Caleb while we investigate the cause of the disruption," the principal said, voice flat and bureaucratic, as if reading a pre-written verdict. Trina asked who had assaulted her son. They replied, "We can't yet confirm." She asked about the cameras. "That area has no coverage," they said. But she didn't need evidence to know. Her son wasn't attacked for being Caleb. He was attacked for being Jeremiah Boone's student. Boone arrived shortly after. Long-sleeved shirt, no tie, a black cane tapping slowly against the floor tiles. He walked through the school halls where students fell silent at the sight of the man from that viral video. But today, Boone did not bow his head. He did not stay silent. He didn't request a meeting. He walked straight into the main lobby, just as the principal and administrative staff were exiting the conference room. Boone stood in front of them, eyes fixed on every face. "I heard you believe Caleb is a threat," he said. No one answered. No one met his gaze. He continued, "If this boy is a threat, then you ought to be even more afraid, because he knows the law. And you fear people who know it." A nearby teacher stepped back. A few students in the distance began filming on their phones. No one spoke. No one intervened. And no one dared admit that, for the first time in years, a student had been beaten not for starting a fight, but for knowing something the system wished they'd forget. Caleb was brought out, lip split, eyes swollen. But when he saw Boone, he uttered a sentence that froze everyone around him. "They didn't hit me for who I am. They hit me for who my teacher is." Boone nodded, saying nothing more. He didn't need to. The answer was already there, in the eyes of those now staring at the true face of justice, not in textbooks, in flesh and blood, standing in the middle of their school. The first video was uploaded barely an hour after Boone had left the campus. The angle was tilted, the footage a bit shaky, but clear enough to show him in a white shirt, cane in hand, walking with a slight limp through a hallway packed with students, heading toward the school's main atrium. His voice rang out, low but deliberate, "If this boy is a threat, then you ought to be even more afraid, because he knows the law." The clip was less than 30 seconds long, but within 3 hours, it had 2 million views. The hashtag #BooneWalksIn trended on Twitter. Even news outlets that had hesitated before now had to cover the story. But this time, the viral image wasn't of an old man kneeling in the mud. It was of a former judge walking into a school to protect his student, using nothing but his presence. No shouting, no permission, just unwavering resolve. Lee May watched the news, eyes locked on the flood of comments. He didn't need to say much, he just needed to be there. Justice may have aged, but it never disappeared. They beat the student because they fear the teacher. Carolyn didn't look at social media. She was printing stills from the school's security footage, the moment Boone had spoken. The expressions on the administrators' faces varied, but they shared one thing: shock. Not because he'd threatened them, but because he had shown up. She looked over at Boone, seated at the table, carefully writing in his notebook. "They used to call you a relic," she said quietly, "but they forgot Some legends know exactly when to return. Caleb was taken home, his injuries treated, but his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages came from classmates, strangers, and student groups from other schools. He wasn't used to the attention, but he no longer felt afraid. He looked over at Boone, still silently seated beside him. You don't have to say anything," Caleb said quietly but firmly. "They've already seen what they needed to see." Boone looked up. His eyes met the boy's. The same boy who had once asked him whether justice was real. Today, Boone didn't answer with definitions. He simply walked into the school at the right time in the right place, as the man the system had tried to erase. And now, though he hadn't said a single word to the press, hadn't written a single public rebuttal, his presence alone had shifted the narrative, because some truths don't need defenders, they just need to be seen. And today, justice wore a student's uniform, but standing behind it was a man who no longer needed a badge to be believed. The printer hummed steadily, not hurried, but unrelenting. On each sheet appeared words unseen for 14 years, original forensic reports, unaltered witness statements, unedited body cam transcripts. Boone sat motionless at the desk, eyes fixed, each page sliding through his fingers like the retrial of a case the system had long refused to open. Carolyn triple-checked the recipient list, an independent newsroom, a state legislator who had once challenged the Attorney General, and a national human rights legal organization. Each would receive a complete, authenticated, individually numbered dossier. Boone signed his name in black ink, the pen strokes bold, unwavering. Caleb stood beside him, witnessing for the first time that signature not on a verdict, but on a declaration, for those who had once been forced into silence. Trina said nothing, simply placed a hand on her son's shoulder, grounding him as history was being rewritten in a modest room. Carolyn glanced at Boone, concern flickering in her gaze. "You know this will provoke them," she said. Boone looked up, unblinking. "We're not staying still anymore. Silence hasn't protected anyone." He sealed each envelope with deliberate care, as if exhuming a body the system had buried deep, but this time for the sake of exposing it without fear. Each copy was hand-numbered, labeled, Eleanor Boone, full archive/witness copy. Boone placed them into a wooden crate, the kind once used to transport confidential court documents. Nothing too modern, no QR codes, just paper, ink, and a signature. He knew no court could deny forever. Carolyn helped label the destination addresses. Trina prepared the delivery certifications. Lee May drafted a concise statement to include not to demand justice, but to declare it had been stolen, and that truth was now the only path to reclaiming it. Boone quietly pulled on his long coat. Caleb watched, eyes no longer those of a child. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked. Boone replied softly, "I'm no longer a judge, but I still have a verdict, and this time, I don't need a bench." They watched Boone walk out, carrying 3 archives containing 14 years of truth. No cameras, no broadcasts, no flash, but everyone knew this was the day he was no longer behind the curtain. This was the day a system that once tried to bury him alive would have to hear him knock again, not with fury, but with evidence, and not asking permission, but claiming his place as someone who had stayed silent long enough to understand. History does not revise itself unless someone dares to pick up the pen. The next morning, the Meridian Ledger, an independent outlet once dismissed by major media for lack of authority, became the epicenter of a media earthquake. The complete Eleanor Boone archive appeared on its front page, under a headline that needed no embellishment. "We let this stay buried for 14 years. Within 6 hours, the digital copy surpassed 500,000 downloads. Journalists from larger networks scrambled to cite it, squeezing in disclaimers like, "if verified." But social media needed no permission. They called it by name. Eleanor Boone, Clayton Reese, and for the first time those names were no longer buried beneath the alias Halton. State Representative Lucille Hardin, who had once gone silent after years of failed inquiries into internal affairs, called for an emergency hearing before the state legislature. She stood before the cameras, holding Boone's printed file, and declared, "I'm not doing this for politics. I'm doing it because I once looked away, and I won't let another trial be postponed one more day." Her video statement was shared with the hashtag #EleanorWasReal. No one called it the 2011 incident anymore. They called it by its rightful name, a belated act of repentance. Boone gave no interviews. He only confirmed he was the sender and stated, "I ask nothing except that those who once stayed silent now begin to speak." Carolyn received calls from 3 attorneys who had once served under her. They wanted in on the upcoming hearing. Lee May was inundated with messages from freelance reporters. She answered none. Instead, she posted a single sentence on her personal page. "Not everyone who stayed silent gave up. Some were preparing to prove it." At Caleb's school, a new sheet appeared on the library bulletin board. A photo of Boone, not in handcuffs, but standing in the school hallway, facing the administration, eyes unbowed. Beneath it was a quote from the archive's accompanying statement. "We don't speak out to attack, we speak out to exist." No one tore the poster down, not out of fear, but because there was no excuse left to remove what the students had already started whispering to each other. He said what we're all afraid to. That evening, Boone sat alone on his familiar wooden chair. No screens, no headlines, no phone buzz. Only the soft rustle of wind through the windows, and the 4th copy of the Eleanor archive, his own, resting on the table. He opened to the first page and added one line in blue ink, handwritten, "If the truth was ever forgotten, then today, at least, someone remembered." Then he closed the file and stood, switching on the single desk lamp, not to read, but to remind himself. From this day forward, the truth was no longer in the dark, and if anyone tried to bury it again, they would have to do so under the gaze of millions who now knew where to look. The state legislative building had never witnessed a hearing quite like this. Long before it began, every seat reserved for the public was filled, and dozens more stood pressed against the back wall, hoping to catch even a fragment of what was to unfold. Journalists jostled for position, struggling to erect their tripods and cameras in the overcrowded chamber. Some news outlets had resorted to rotating their crews in shifts. There simply wasn't enough room for them all to report from inside. Online, the hashtag #EleanorHearing dominated every platform, topping trending lists for a full 24 hours. It was more than a story now, it was a reckoning. And yet, amid the noise, the flashing lights, the buzzing anticipation, Jeremiah Boone entered the room like silence itself, his gray coat draped neatly over his shoulders, black cane tapping gently against the marble floor, and, in his hand, an old leather briefcase, weathered but firm. He came alone. No entourage, no legal team, no publicist. Only himself, and the file thick with documents, pages that someone had once tried, quite literally, to burn out of existence. The Human Rights Committee, composed of 9 individuals, a mix of elected officials and independent experts, sat in their chairs as Boone was called forward. He didn't open the briefcase right away. Instead, he carefully unfolded a sheet of paper, creased into thirds, written in dark blue ink. The words had been crossed out and rewritten in places, bearing the marks of quiet deliberation. Then, lifting his eyes, Boone looked directly at those seated before him, men and women who had in the past avoided his gaze. Now they sat stiffly, barely breathing. "I haven't come here to prove I was right," he said, voice low, slightly hoarse, yet unwavering. "I've come to ask each of you, how many times have you stayed silent, not because you didn't know, but because you believed you didn't have the right to speak?" A hush fell across the chamber, not because the question was new, but because it was true. One by one, witnesses stepped forward. Each statement, each voice carried weight. A nurse, hair streaked with gray, recounted the moment she was pressured into signing off on a report that didn't match the medical record. A forensic technician admitted with visible shame that he had never been granted access to the full police body cam footage. A young dispatcher, barely out of her 20s at the time of the incident, described Alorna's phone call. She wasn't panicked, she said, eyes fixed on the room. She just said, "There's been a mistake. Please come quickly." And finally, a young police officer, not listed on the agenda, stood and asked to speak. His voice trembled. His eyes were wet, but his tone was firm. "I was assigned to monitor public reaction to Mr. Boone," he said. I wrote fake reports. I falsified updates. I was afraid the truth wouldn't matter, that no one would use it. Each statement landed like a crack in the facade, splintering the structure Scott Withers had spent so long fortifying with bravado and hollow speeches. Through it all, Boone sat motionless. No note-taking, no interruptions. His hands rested gently on the head of his cane. His eyes remained fixed on the head of his cane. His eyes remained fixed on the panel, eyes that had spent decades learning how to wait, but never how to be ignored. When the session broke for recess, Boone rose slowly and made his way to the hallway. Reporters parted, whispers buzzing. But this time no one called him the former judge who was arrested. They called him by his name, Jeremiah Boone. And the names of the witnesses? No longer marked as anonymous for security reasons. Their voices, once stifled, had become hammers, striking down not people, but silence. At the threshold, Boone paused and looked back into the chamber. He did not smile. He didn't need to. His eyes alone told those watching, those behind the camera lenses, those scrolling in silence at home, that this was no longer the story of one man beaten. This was about an entire generation that had been taught that truth only belonged to those with power. That afternoon, the witness chair was taken by the man most anticipated and most feared by everyone present, Scott Withers. He wore a navy suit, a red-striped tie, and an expression of meticulous composure. His eyes never left the television cameras, and he walked with the rehearsed calm of someone who had practiced every gesture. But no one in the room believed it would be enough. Not today, because today was no campaign event, no controlled rally. It was a public hearing. Every word would be transcribed. Every eye movement, every hesitation could be replayed. Even the way he swallowed could betray him. Scott was asked to respond to a series of issues. The Eleanor case, the use of Clayton Reese in his campaign, and allegations of implicit direction in Boone's assault. He recycled familiar phrases. I had no direct involvement. I wasn't aware of that instruction. If any negligence occurred, it was at the lower levels. Each answer was wrapped in rubber. Nothing could pierce it, but nothing could grip it either. The committee let him speak without interruption. Everyone was waiting for another voice. Jeremiah Boone was invited to return to the microphone. He rose, slowly but steadily, back straight despite the cane. As he approached, he did not immediately address Scott. He looked instead at the panel, then at the gallery. Only then did he turn his gaze to the man who had spent years issuing orders from the shadows. I'm not going to ask you about Reese, Boone said. Not about campaign funds. Not about your father's connections to those who helped him dodge accountability. He paused. I have only one question. The silence was immediate. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Boone's gaze locked onto Scott Withers, not with fury, not with contempt, but with a calm so complete it chilled the room. You thought I had nothing left to lose, didn't you? Scott's lips parted. No words came out. His pupils twitched. One hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly that the wood creaked. For a single, unguarded moment, everyone in the room saw it. He had no answer. Not because the question was complex, but it didn't ask for logic. It was a sentence, not a query, a conviction without a courtroom. Boone didn't wait. He returned to his seat. The hearing was no longer the same. From that moment on, Scott Withers could not hide behind polished statements. He had been nailed in place, not by accusation, but by a single question. A question every powerful man dreads to hear, especially from someone who stands before him with nothing left but the truth. When the session ended, Boone moved slowly down the main corridor. Caleb stood waiting at the far end. No one stopped Boone. No one dared to call him back. Cameras followed. Silent. He placed a hand gently on Caleb's shoulder. His expression remained calm, composed. They can't look me in the eye anymore, he said. That's enough. And then he walked out of the building, his back straight, his steps sure, like justice itself had risen from the record, and now walked beside him through a system that no longer knew who to face or how. On Tuesday afternoon, before the midday news finished covering the aftermath of the hearing, the state prosecutor's office held an emergency press conference. Standing amid microphones bearing major media logos, The chief prosecutor held 3 thick indictments in his hand. He read each charge slowly, clearly. Scott Withers, indicted for administrative abuse of power, witness intimidation, and obstruction of a federal investigation. No theatrics, no sensationalism, but each word landed like a hammer striking the stone foundation of a system that once believed it could never be named. Scott was arrested later that same day. No handcuffs, no force, but escorted silently by 2 federal agents from his campaign headquarters. When reporters swarmed in calling his name, he didn't respond, didn't look at anyone, didn't utter a single word. He only lowered his head slightly as he stepped into the car, as if, in that brief moment, he realized his recent public denials were no longer a shield, but evidence that he had long known he'd crossed a line. Around the same time, the 3 officers involved in Boone's arrest were also taken into custody. Internal reports revealed encrypted messages had been sent from one of Withers' campaign aides to a private radio device with instructions: test his reaction, make sure he doesn't go public again. A search of the command unit's headquarters uncovered hand-edited shift logs that conflicted with GPS records. None of the officers resisted. One, the oldest among them, even asked to make a call to my wife to tell her not to watch the evening news. Boone was at home, reading letters from law students across the country when Carolyn walked in and placed her phone on the table. "They've filed charges," she said. Boone looked up, silent for a few seconds. Then he folded the letter he'd been reading, set it neatly beside his tea, and replied, "He wasn't defeated by me. He was defeated by the very thing he thought no one believed in anymore. The law." That sentence spread quickly across social media, not because it was flashy, but because it was sharp, clear, and hit just hard enough to make doubters of justice pause. The Meridian Ledger's evening news opened with a close-up shot of Boone writing, the chyron below reading, "Truth is not something to win with, it's what remains when everything else falls away." As night fell, the courthouse lights stayed on. The emergency review unit was sorting through case files tied to decisions pushed through when Withers was still a powerful candidate, and buried somewhere in that sea of data was the name Eleanor, the woman erased from all previous reports. But now, they no longer had the authority to erase her, because that name, after 14 years, was finally spoken in full, not as a casualty, but as a witness. By Thursday morning, the Eastport Journal, one of the nation's most respected investigative magazines, released a special issue with a black and white cover, an angled photo of Eleanor Boone, her eyes unsmiling, alongside the simple headline, "The Woman Not Allowed to Live to Speak." Inside was an 80-page report, edited and verified by Lee May, based on original documents, audio recordings, and evidence from Boone's files. There was no doubt left. Eleanor was not collateral damage. She was the only one who knew the wrongful arrest was ordered administratively, and she had intended to leak the proof before being shot dead. The report showed Eleanor had backed up an internal reassignment order bearing a faint signature from the regional commander. The night before her death, she printed the final copy to send to an independent journalist. Security footage from the post office showed her calmly standing in line, unafraid, unhidden. But the next morning she was gunned down in the street, recorded as caught in a volatile arrest. No witnesses, no convictions. And since then, her name vanished from every official record. The legal community's response was fiercer than expected. National bar associations called for a 10-year audit of internal investigations. 2 senior police officials resigned after their names appeared under the category "received internal report copies but did not respond." Even those who once claimed Boone was over-dramatizing everything now admitted, had he not preserved every page, the truth would have gone up in smoke without leaving a trail. Boone made no public statements. He simply folded that morning's paper, poured more tea, and continued writing in his old notebook. Caleb saw him, stepped closer, and asked quietly, "Do you think truth can change the world?" Boone looked up, his eyes not tired but still and deep. "No, but it changes people just enough so they stop helping what's wrong. That line didn't appear on any news broadcast, but it etched itself into the mind of a boy who once thought the law was something to memorize, not something to defend what's right. That evening, Carolyn arrived with an old wooden nameplate once belonging to Boone's federal judge office, removed after his retirement. She set it on the table and said, "I think you should take your name back, not to return to court, but to remind them you never really left." Boone didn't respond. He simply nodded, then picked up his pen and wrote the final line in his journal. "Truth is never a weapon. It is what people pick up when they no longer want to use force." On the table, beside Eleanor's case file, was a framed, handwritten note. They don't kill someone because she knew it was wrong. They kill her because she still dared to say it was. And this time, no one could burn those pages again. The early March wind slipped through yellowed window panes, casting soft light across the old wooden table in the abandoned church. What was once a place for prayer had been rearranged into a small classroom. No chalkboard, no projector, only a faded map of the United States taped to the center wall. Red dots marked places where someone had once been wrongfully convicted, silenced, or simply forgotten. Jeremiah Boone stood before a group of teenagers, 16 to 17-year-olds, black and brown kids with eyes full of doubt and hunger. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't read a bio. He simply placed his hand on the map and asked, "How many of you have ever thought the law was made to protect you?" Caleb sat in the front row, a worn wooden pen resting between his hands. He didn't raise his hand, but his gaze was unwavering. Boone nodded, as if that alone was enough of an answer. He began the class not with theory, but with a story about the Briggs case and how a single line in a legal file could save or destroy a human life, about the perjury statute he once used to protect a threatened witness. Each example came from a courtroom, not a textbook. Each statute was stripped of its robes, so the students could see justice not as something lofty, but something present, found in daily encounters between right and wrong. Jamal, a 15-year-old once suspended for talking back with attitude, raised his hand and asked, if the law protects people, why do black folks still get beaten when they don't fight back? Boone replied without hesitation, because the law has no heart, but someone who understands it can stop injustice from piercing someone else's. The room fell silent, not out of confusion, but because for the first time they were hearing someone acknowledge injustice and teach how to fight it without losing themselves. Near the window stood a simple shelf holding the old legal volumes Boone had once used as a judge. Each book was marked, not with highlighters, but handwritten notes. This clause saved someone's life. Don't skip this article. Use this when they deny your petition. These notes were more valuable than any textbook. They didn't teach for exams. They taught survival. Trina whispered to Carolyn from the back, "This is the kind of class I wish my son had." When class ended, Boone didn't say goodbye or thank you. He simply nodded, turned back to the map, and added a new red dot, right over Eastport. One student asked, "What does that mark mean?" Boone answered, "It means this is the place where, for the first time, a kid who knew the law wasn't punished for being right." As the students quietly packed up, Boone looked out the window, where the sun was lowering, but the light still reached the wooden plaque above the map, a line he never read aloud, but everyone paused to read. At the far end of the room, above the old map, hung a bare wooden plaque. No paint, no frame, just deep, unvarnished carving. "It's not because I was once a judge that I deserve respect, but because I never knelt before what was wrong." Boone hadn't put that quote there to be admired. He placed it so that the students could see. You can strip a person of titles, but never of how they chose to live. The class grew with each session. No ads, no flyers, no funding, yet each time more chairs appeared. More faces showed up, mostly students of color who'd been suspended, denied scholarships, or warned their attitude didn't fit academic culture. Trina came to teach resume writing for students rejected by the zip code. Carolyn shared tricks for spotting altered documents. Lee May quietly filmed each session, not for the public, but to archive them. For the day someone needs to hear the voice of justice. not the voice of the system. Boone never called it a legal center or pre-law program. He simply called it the reading room. Here, he didn't teach kids how to win cases. He taught them how not to bow to injustice just because they didn't speak the courtroom's language. On difficult days, he let Caleb teach. The boy was unsure at first, but gradually grew louder, clearer, and quieter, just like Boone had once taught. Don't teach like someone who knows it all. Teach like someone still proving they haven't stepped back. One afternoon, Boone sat alone after class, lightly tapping his pen on his notebook. Caleb stepped outside with a student notebook in hand and asked quietly, "Are you afraid people will forget again someday?" Boone smiled, not with sadness. No one escapes being forgotten. But the truth doesn't need to be remembered forever. It just needs not to disappear like it never existed. Then he pointed to the classroom behind them, filled with voices debating justice, flipping pages, and arguing over legal clauses. As long as real people speak about what's right, truth still has a place. Caleb returned to the classroom to finish the lesson. Boone remained outside, placing his hand gently over the carved words. He didn't raise his chin. He didn't tear up. He simply traced each letter, as though touching the spine that had held him up for years. That quote would never be broadcast. It wasn't a logo, but every student in that room had read it, and when they bowed, it wasn't in fear. It was because they understood. It couldn't be ignored. The story didn't end with a medal. No bronze statue would be built. But the day Caleb walked out of class with eyes firm as stone and another student asked, "Will you be teaching again?" that was the moment Boone knew. He didn't need to be remembered. He just needed to make sure that when the next child was put on trial by the system, at least one person would know how to respond in the language of what is right. And that was his land. Not granted, simply never taken back. The story of Jeremiah Boone is not just a personal journey. It is a powerful reminder. Never judge anyone based on prejudice. Boone, a retired judge, an old man living in seclusion, once labeled and dismissed in countless ways, turned out to be the very person who stood up when the system needed to confront the truth. He didn't speak out to be praised. He spoke out to remind us that sometimes the things we thought had died can still come back to life if someone is willing to give them one final breath. From a child beaten for understanding the law to an old man being watched for refusing to forget, this story shows us that value and talent do not lie in age or title, but in how one responds when the truth is being twisted. Justice doesn't always win immediately, but it can win in the end if enough people don't give up. Have you ever been misjudged simply because someone didn't understand you? Have you ever been underestimated, only to quietly prove you were far more capable than they believed? If this story made you think, share it. Share it so someone who has stayed silent knows they're not alone. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep following these honest stories where justice doesn't need to shout to be believed. It only needs one person to stand up at the right moment.